Yeah, for coming to this last talk. So my circumstances. Thanks a lot. Okay, so yeah, we're going to talk about the Stoics on unqualified call, right? Yes. So you have about 45 minutes.
Great, thank you. Thank you to Ricardo and everybody else here for organizing the conference. I've enjoyed everybody's talks that I got to see yesterday, and I'm really happy to be here. The Stoics enjoy classifying bodies. They divide bodies up into those that are active versus passive. There are, of course, the four so-called categories. They divide bodies up into those that are conjoined versus dispersed versus unified. All things considered, it seems that the Stoics found it useful to divide bodies up in this way. In looking at the evidence for Stoic physics, there is an implicit classification of bodies in that evidence, namely between bodies that are qualified, poia, and bodies that are unqualified, apoia. Somewhat surprisingly, this doesn't receive a ton of attention in the secondary literature. It's surprising because one of the most theoretically important bodies in Stoic physics, the passive principle, is said to be unqualified by the Stoics themselves, or at least so I will argue in a few minutes. If we knew what it was to be unqualified, then we would know something more about this very slippery body, the passive principle. So that's what I propose to do today. I'm going to try to figure out what do the Stoics mean when they describe the passive principle or anybody as unqualified. After arguing that the Stoics do in fact posit an unqualified body, the passive principle, I'm just going to run through a few potential options for what unqualifiedness is in Stoic physics. I will point out at the beginning, I'm not particularly wedded to any of these options. I think that they all have advantages and disadvantages, although I'm going to spend majority of the time sort of defending one option that I don't think has been articulated in the literature sufficiently at this point. Okay, so first, let's actually establish that the Stoics call certain bodies, or at least one body, unqualified. So on the handout, there's an important passage from Diogenes Laertius, book 7, section 134. It's going to be important at several points in the talk today, so I'm going to go ahead and read it out loud. They think that there are two principles of the whole of things, the active and the passive. The passive is unqualified substance, i.e. matter, and the active is the reason in it, i.e. God. For this one, being eternal crafts each thing through all of it. Zeno of Citium puts forward this doctrine in On Substance, Cleanthes in On the Atoms, Chrysippus in the first book of Physics near the end, Archetimus in On Elements, and Posidonius in the second book of the Physical Account. They say that the principles and elements differ, for the former are ungenerated and indestructible, while the elements are destroyed during the conflagration. But the principles are both bodies and formless, while the elements have been formed. So we have citations to each of the first three scholarchs, Posidonius and Archetimus, so we seem to have an orthodox Stoic theory being presented here. And clearly the names for the passive principle, at least in this passage, are matter and apoiasousia, unqualified substance. Additionally, in the last bit of the passage, the principles are said to be bodies. Thus, we appear to have at least one unqualified body in Stoic physics, the passive principle. This gets confirmed by a potential fragment of Arius Didymus and Stobaeus, where he says that Posidonius said that the substance of the whole of things and matter is unqualified and formless, according to which it has no particular defined shape nor per se quality, but it's always in some shape and quality. Other sources seem to confirm this, sources as diverse as Alexander of Aphrodisias, Chalcidius, Pseudo-Galen, Plotinus. Plutarch, as we're going to see in a minute ago, seems to put unqualified in quotation marks in attributing to the Stoics the view that there's an unqualified substance or matter. So all things considered, it seems reasonably, we can be reasonably confident that the Stoics did indeed claim that the passive principle is an unqualified body. To my knowledge, there's no direct evidence that they called another body unqualified. There might be some indirect, like we could make some inferences that other bodies are unqualified in Stoic physics, but none of the sources seem to call another body unqualified that I'm aware of, at least. Okay, so passive principle is an unqualified body in Stoic physics. So what does it mean to say that the passive principle is unqualified? There are a few options that have been presented in the secondary literature so far, one of which is supported by this passage from Plutarch at the bottom of page 1. So Plutarch says, this is in the middle of a long critique of the Stoic theory of the passive principle. And he says, the reasoning advanced by some of them as giving substance the epithet without quality, not because it's devoid of every quality, but because it has all qualities, is most especially at odds with the common conception. For no one conceives as without quality what is without part and no quality, or as impassive what is naturally always being affected in all respects, nor as immobile what is in every way movable. So in his 2009 article or chapter, The Stoics on Matter and Prime Matter, Jean-Baptiste Gournat uses this passage to try to analyze the unqualifiedness of the passive principle. And on the basis of that, he puts forward the all properties analysis of unqualifiedness, where unqualifiedness is the possession of all the basic characteristics of the four elements, at least. Now, I will point out, I'm not sure that Gournat is actually endorsing this as the full account of the passive principle's unqualifiedness. He uses it to try to solve a puzzle in Diogenes Laertius, where Diogenes Laertius says that the four elements taken together are unqualified substance, i.e. matter. And Gournat uses the bit from Plutarch to try to figure out why does Diogenes say that, because it's a very puzzling thing to say. But in any case, he raises this possibility, and I think it's worth considering whether it could be the unqualifiedness of the passive principle. It's a really weird view if this is the Stoics' view. So I think Plutarch is correct that it would be really strange to say that the characteristic of lacking quality is the possession of all qualities. Given the analogies that Plutarch lists, it would just be very strange to say that. In addition to that, I think it sort of gets the intuitive order of explanation wrong. It seems more natural to say that the passive principle can possess all the basic characteristics of the four elements because it's unqualified, rather than try to analyze the unqualifiedness in terms of the possession of all the basic characteristics of the four elements. Now, of course, that's just sort of an intuitive reason to reject it, but yeah. Additionally, I don't think it's true that the passive principle, period, would be unqualified according to this analysis. So let's say that I could isolate a portion of the passive principle, which is currently instantiating, let's say, the watery characteristics. So it's wet. And let's assume there's no other characteristics mixed in with the water at this point. Then it's not true that this portion of the passive principle would be unqualified according to all properties, because it doesn't have all properties. It only has the basic characteristics of water, not the other elements. And so it looks like we could only say that the entirety of the passive principle is unqualified according to the all properties analysis. And that just seems sort of ad hoc to me. Additionally, there are periods in the life of the cosmos in which the passive principle as a whole would not have all of the basic characteristics of the four elements. Namely, during periods of conflagration, it would only possess the characteristics associated with fire. And so it looks like I could only say that the entirety of the passive principle during the cosmic order, or the passive principle understood sort of diachronically or eternally, is unqualified according to the all properties analysis, which again seems somewhat ad hoc to me. So for these reasons, I'm not in love with the all properties analysis. However, if Plutarch can be trusted, some of the Stoics put forward this analysis. And so the question is, okay, if we trust him on that, what do we do with this? And so I would propose that maybe what's going on is Plutarch is reporting a later Stoic attempt to understand the earlier Orthodox Stoic account of unqualifiedness. Namely, the earlier Stoic account is that the passive principle, though it possesses all the basic qualifications of the four elements, in and of itself lacks those characteristics. And so I can imagine a random Stoic receiving this Orthodox Stoic view and saying, I'm worried that this unqualifiedness characteristic is never actually instantiated by the passive principle, that it's not a real property, that it's unqualified in name alone. And so I'm just going to deflate unqualifiedness and say that it's not the lack in and of itself of basic characteristics, it's the possession of all characteristics. It's maybe a little less, a little easier to grasp if that were their analysis. But according to this hypothesis, it's not the official Orthodox Stoic view, the all properties analysis, that is. It's a later Stoic attempt to make sense of the earlier Orthodox Stoic view. That's just a hypothesis, though. I'm not exactly sure what to do with Plutarch saying that some Stoics endorse this. Okay, so I want to move on to the next account of unqualifiedness. I would say if there is a consensus, this is it. As I said, people don't spend a ton of time analyzing unqualifiedness, but especially in conversation with other people who study the Stoics, this has been the one that has been proposed to me most often. And David Sedley, in his 2011 chapter, Matter in Hellenistic Philosophy, is a representative of it, I think. So he writes in that article, prime matter is therefore not, other than in a very attenuated sense, a building material, understood dynamically. Rather, it is that which permanently underlies the world, providing the locus of change without changing its own properties, since it does not, in fact, have any properties. Hence, the sources frequently call it apoiousia, qualityless substance. So Sedley says that the passive principle lacks all properties, and this is why it's called apoiousia. Now, I want to interpret him charitably, and I don't think he's meaning literally the passive principle lacks all properties, because then it would not be a body, it would not be extended in 3 dimensions, it would not be passive, let's say. So if we wanted to interpret him charitably, we can go back to the 4 basic characteristics of the 4 elements and say that unqualifiedness is the lack of the basic characteristics of the 4 elements. This is the no properties analysis of the passive principle's unqualifiedness. And this fits well with the idea that the passive principle in and of itself lacks these characteristics, but it can take them on when it's acted on by the active principle. As I said, if there is a consensus, I would say this is it. However, I think there's a couple problems with it that haven't been noted, at least to my knowledge. So in the bit from Diogenes Laertius 7:134, formlessness and unqualifiedness are presented as 2 different characteristics or lack of characteristics. So if you go back to that passage, in the last bit of it, the principles and the elements are distinguished from one another. The principles are ungenerated and indestructible, while the elements are destroyed and presumably can be generated at certain times. So essentially, the elements are mutable bits of reality, while the principles are eternal. Additionally, the principles are formless bodies, amorphous bodies, while the elements have been formed or have been informed. It's not totally clear what this means to say that the principles are formless and the elements have been informed. However, many people have noted or suggested that while the elements, insofar as they are a particular element like fire, let's say, have defined, determinate, observable, specifiable characteristics in and of themselves, the principles do not, perhaps. So for example, if I've got a portion of fire, it's got to be hot. Unless it's hot, it's not fire. If I have a portion of earth, it's got to be dry. In order to be earth, it has to be dry. Whereas the principles are sort of understood, or at least they can be understood functionally, right? They interact in a certain way to produce a certain result, but the particular bodies that actually produce that result, it's kind of indeterminate what those bodies are. And so the idea is the principles are somewhat indeterminate, while the elements are sort of determinate. They have determinate, specifiable characteristics. And so I would suggest that it looks like formlessness either is or entails that the principles lack the basic elemental characteristics associated with the 4 elements. And formlessness is that property, not unqualifiedness, at least according to Diogenes' presentation. There is a related problem, which is that only the passive principle is called unqualified. But the active principle, if that account of formlessness is correct, lacks the basic characteristics of the 4 elements as well. So the active principle should be unqualified if unqualifiedness is the lack of basic elemental characteristics. However, it's never called unqualified. Only the passive principle is called unqualified, including by Diogenes himself here. Which I think is not a knockdown argument against the no properties analysis. However, I do think it could motivate us to try to find a different analysis according to which only the passive principle would count as unqualified and not the active principle. So that's what I propose to do for the rest of the talk. Okay, so I'm going to go really kind of indirectly here and sort of in a circuitous route. I'm going to talk about qualities and the relation between qualities and qualified bodies. And then I'm going to discuss at least one source on the different types of qualified bodies, try to derive an account of unqualifiedness from sort of reverse engineering that from an account of the qualified body. Okay, so hopefully I get there by the end. We'll see. Okay, so qualified, yeah, all right. So according to the Stoics, qualities are bodies. So there are a few different sources that just explicitly say this, one of which is Simplicius, which I'll look at in a second. But also there's these couple passages from Galen in which he says, he attributes the view that qualities are bodies to Zeno in particular. And in fact, he uses the language of blending in ascribing that view to Zeno, which we might be kind of skeptical that Zeno had a worked out theory of blending at that point. But it's at least a potential retroactive ascription of the later Stoic theory onto Zeno, which might be some evidence at least. But in any case, qualities are bodies. Which bodies are they? They are pneumata. So here in this Simplicius passage down at the bottom of page 2, he says the Stoics say that qualities of bodies are corporeal. And then a bit later, he asks a question implying that the substance of corporeal qualities is pneumatic, according to the Stoics, meaning that qualities are made out of pneuma somehow. Pneuma, for those who don't know, is just mixture of fire and air, according to the Stoics. Very important passage, which is going to be important for me, is this passage on page 3 from Plutarch, in which he paraphrases Chrysippus, then apparently quotes Chrysippus according to some editors, and then tries to connect Chrysippus's view to the Stoic view in general. I'm going to go ahead and read this entire passage out loud. Furthermore, Chrysippus says that air is naturally dark, and he uses this as evidence of the fact that it's also primarily cold, for its darkness is opposed to fire's brilliance, and its coldness to fire's heat. Putting forward these claims in the first book of his Physical Investigations, in turn, in his On Hexes, he says that hexes are nothing but volumes of air, for bodies are held together by these. This is where most editors start the quotation. And the cohesive air is causally responsible for the fact that each thing is qualified among bodies held together by hexes. Cohesive air, which people call hardness in iron, denseness in stone, and whiteness in silver. He raises a couple problems for the Stoics, namely air's got its own qualities. Why don't those transfer to the things that it acts on? But then he picks up the reporting again. Yet everywhere they declare that matter, of itself inert and unmoving, underlies qualities, and that qualities, being pneumata and aeriform tensions, form and shape each of the parts of matter in which they come to be. Okay, so Chrysippus, if we take this as a close paraphrase of Chrysippus or a quotation of Chrysippus, describes a relationship between a few different bodies in his physics. So there's a body, cohesive air, or the air that holds together, which he and Plutarch seem to equate to hexes. And this body acts as a cause to another body, namely each of the things held together by hexes. And it's the cause to that body of that being qualified, right? So the cohesive air is a cause to each of the things held together by hexes of being qualified. So you have this cohesive air stuff, this hexis, being assigned a causal role in Chrysippus's physics of qualifying each of the things held together by hexes. He gives us examples as well. He says that we call this, or they call this, people call this cohesive air different things depending on the type of body that it's acting on or present within. For example, whiteness would be the cohesive air in a piece of silver, and presumably this whiteness acts on the silver or possibly a passive constituent of the silver, qua white thing, it is a cause to that silver of its being white, if you wanted to try to apply the analysis to a particular object. So this cohesive air is a hexis, is a cause of inanimate objects at least being qualified. And then Plutarch says that according to the Stoics, qualities are pneumata, and presumably these qualities, these pneumata, are supposed to be somehow identified with the cause of inanimate objects being qualified, the cohesive air. So there's this connection between each of these concepts in Chrysippus and Stoic physics, possibly. So Chrysippus and Plutarch invoke the concept of hexis. Hexis is another important concept in Stoic physics. So hexis is a word that refers to a genus whose species are particular types of pneuma. The species of hexis are soul, which is related to animals, nature, which is related to plants, and then mere or bare hexis, which is related to inanimate objects. And any unified body, according to Sextus Empiricus, is governed by a single hexis, a single volume of pneuma. So unified bodies seem to have a volume of pneuma within them that's governing them. And Chrysippus, at least, and from the passage in Plutarch, seems to identify hexis as the cause of certain things being qualified. Additionally, Simplicius seems to relate this concept of hexis and unified bodies to qualities explicitly. He writes, "For the Stoics call qualities havable and allow what is havable to exist only in the case of unified things, whereas in the case of things which exist by contact, like a ship, or by separation, like an army, they rule out there being anything havable, or there being found in their case any single pneumatic thing, or possessing a single principle, such as to achieve a realization of a single hexis. But they, i.e. conjoined and dispersed objects with which the Stoics should classify as qualified, are qualified things which lack a quality, or there's no hexis in them, since a quality or a hexis is never found in separated substances which have no inherent union with one another." So based on Simplicius, it looks like only unified bodies have qualities because quality and hexis are being treated as interchangeable by Simplicius, and only unified bodies have hexis, according to the Stoics. And so again, quality is being loosely identified with hexis, which is being loosely identified with pneuma. And these bodies, or this body, is a body that is a cause to the unified body of certain effects. It governs them, it qualifies them, it unifies them potentially. Okay, so that is the relationship between quality, or hexis, or pneuma, and the bodies that contain that pneuma. There's a very long passage from Simplicius on page 4 of the handout, which I'm not going to read out loud because it's very long. And I think that most people are aware of it here. Even if they're not, the things that I want to extract from it, I think are relatively uncontroversial. And those things that I want to extract from it are on page 5 of the handout. But I've given you the passage in case you want to talk about it later. So the Stoics, according to this passage, give a threefold account, or they divide bodies up into 3 types of qualified bodies. Sorry, they divide qualified bodies up into 3 main types. And then the third type gets divided up even further. The first type of qualified body is something that is kata diaphoron, differentiated. So an example of this from this passage would be a person who is running. So a person who is running is differentiated, but they wouldn't fall into the other types of qualified body. The second type of qualified body is something that is in a differentiated state, as contrasted with a kinesis. So the example of the second type of qualified body is a person with their guard up. So they would be the second type of qualified body, but not the third, because the third type of qualified body is in an enduringly differentiated state. I think the word is in monos. And so the example for this third type of qualified body would be a prudent person. So the running person and the person with their guard up are not qualified in the third sense. They are not in an enduringly differentiated state. He further subdivides this third type, and like the most specific and narrow type of qualified body would be in an enduringly differentiated state, matching the expression and notion. I think the idea is supposed to be the prudent person, insofar as they are prudent, have all and only the characteristics of the prudent person, but I'm not exactly sure what is meant there. Okay, so these are 3 types of qualified body listed by Simplicius, attributed to the Stoics. We might try to reverse engineer an account of an unqualified body from these types of qualified bodies. As a first stab, we might take the broadest account of a qualified body, something that's differentiated, and say that an unqualified body, in the way that the passive principle is unqualified, is totally undifferentiated. They are not kata diaphoron, or it is not kata diaphoron. So according to the no differentiation analysis, unqualifiedness would be the complete lack of differentiation, and an unqualified body is not kata diaphoron. This sounds somewhat intuitive to me on the surface. However, I don't think it's consistent with how the Stoics describe bodies that are kata diaphoron and how they describe the principles. Namely, the principles seem to count as relatives, according to the Stoics, things that are prosti. So I'm taking this from Matthew Duncombe in his 2020 book, Ancient Relativity. So the principles are conceived causally, or at least they can be. The active principle acts on the passive principle, or the active principle is characterized by its power in relation to the passive principle. And the passive principle is characterized by its passivity in relation to the active principle. So they seem to count as relative things. And by calling them relative, I'm not saying that they are prosti posekanta, just that they are prosti. However, the Stoics say that relatives, in this sense, are differentiated things. They are kata diaphoron. And so insofar as, number one, the passive principle is a relative, and number two, relative things are differentiated, then, and three, the passive principle is unqualified, the unqualifiedness could not be the lack of differentiation. So I don't think this is going to work, even though it sounded somewhat intuitive to me when I was thinking of it. Instead, maybe we could use the third type of unqualified body to try to derive and reverse engineer an account of the unqualified body. Namely, an unqualified body might be one that is not in an enduringly differentiated state. So what makes a body a qualified body in the third sense? What makes a body in an enduringly differentiated state? I would suggest that it is the internal pneuma within the body, holding it together in a particular way. The example listed for the third type of qualified body is a prudent person. What makes a person prudent? The prudence within them. So according to Zeno, at least, he says that prudence is a cause that makes it impossible that the prudent person is not prudent. Then prudence seems to be the hegemonicon, or the soul in a certain state. And the soul is made out of pneuma. So there's some pneuma within the person, which is identifiable as prudence, which necessitates that the prudent person is prudent in an enduring way. And I would suggest that any body that is in an enduringly differentiated state possesses some sort of inherent internal cause of its being differentiated in that way. And usually that cause is going to end up being pneuma, according to the Stoics. So if a body is not a qualified body in the third sense and is an unqualified body in the third sense, then it would lack an inherent cause of differentiation. And unqualified three bodies, as such, lack an internal pneuma, causing them to be differentiated in a certain state. So some examples of things that wouldn't qualify, right? So I have a stone. The stone, insofar as it is a stone, contains a hexis as a part, which holds it together as a stone in an enduring way. Even the running person. So the running person, insofar as they are a running person, they would not have an internal cause which necessitates that they run. But insofar as they're a person, they would. So insofar as they're a person, they're going to have an internal pneuma causing them to be a person. So if a body is unqualifiedly unqualified, according to the inertness analysis, it would lack any internal cause of its being eternally differentiated in any way. That's my suggestion. Okay. That's why I wanted to talk about qualities a minute ago. One potential advantage or problem for this account is that certain bodies would count as unqualified even if they possess specifiable observable characteristics, namely earth and water. So I will point out, I am not the first person to suggest this. In his 1985 article, The Stoic Theory of Change, David Hom suggests this. Great article that I consistently come back to. But in any case, the reason why earth and water would count as unqualified, according to this account, can be seen in this passage from Plutarch, again, at the top of page 6 of the handout. So Plutarch says, in any case, the Stoics, while calling the four bodies earth and water and air and fire primary elements, make some of them, I know not how, simple and pure, and others composite and mixed. For they say that earth and water neither hold themselves together nor other things, but maintain their unity by virtue of participation in a pneumatic and fiery power. The air and fire, because of their tension, can hold themselves together, and to the former two, when blended with them, impart tension and stability and substantiality. So this is a view that shows up in a few sources, but the Stoics apparently think that earth and water lack tension, and this seems to mean that they are unable to hold themselves together. Now, of course, they're unable to hold themselves together as any particular object, right? Earth and water on their own can't make a stone. The stone needs some hexus in the earth and water holding it together as a stone. But the point seems to be even more dramatic, namely that earth and water can't maintain themselves as earth and water on their own. A bit later in the same section of the On Common Conceptions, Plutarch says that earth needs air to hold it together as earth, suggesting that if I were to get a pure portion of earth and water without any fire and air acting on it, then something would happen such that it would stop being a coherent bit of earth and water. What exactly would happen? I'm not sure. Maybe it disperses and falls through the void in infinitesimal bits. Maybe it starts expanding and turning into other elements, namely air and fire. But in any case, it doesn't seem, these two elements don't seem to be able to hold themselves together as earth and water. They need to be acted on by fire and air in order to maintain themselves as earth and water. So on the one hand, earth and water are not pneuma. On the other hand, they don't have pneuma as a part, right? They don't have an inherent cause of enduring differentiation, and they can't hold themselves together. So they would seem to be unqualified according to the inertness analysis. Again, either an interesting result or a problem. On the other hand, as you saw, fire and air can hold themselves together as fire and air. They are tense. They are tense, and so they can hold themselves together. In addition to this, as I said, qualities seem to be made out of pneuma, and so qualities seem to inherit this ability for pneuma to hold itself together. Namely, qualities are able to maintain themselves as particular qualities by qualifying themselves, at least that's one reading of this Simplicius passage, where he says that the Stoics postulate qualities of qualities, making them havable states of themselves, for they no longer need qualities which provide differentia, since the qualities themselves differ from each other by themselves. So qualities are havable states of themselves. One way to read this is that qualities somehow qualify themselves, maintain themselves as certain qualities. I'm taking this from Bernard Kolet-Ducic and Ryer Helly. So fire and air can hold themselves together. Qualities are made out of fire and air, so qualities can also hold themselves together in virtue of being made out of fire and air. I think that would be the physics of the view. The inertness analysis would also align well with how the principles are described by a few different sources. Namely, the passive principle is unable to cause itself to do anything, to become differentiated. So Sextus Empiricus reports an apparently Stoic argument for the necessity of the active principle, which is also a god. And he starts off this argument by saying, the substance of beings, they say, being per se motionless and shapeless, needs to be moved and shaped by some cause. And because of this, just as when we look at some beautiful bronze, we want to know the artist, given that matter is per se motionless, so too seeing the matter of the whole of things moving and being in a form and cosmic order, we could reasonably inquire into the cause that moves it and forms it in many ways. So the passive principle is motionless in and of itself, and it's unable to cause itself to become anything in particular or be differentiated in any way. Thus, there needs to be a cause that moves matter, namely the active principle. He continues, it's not persuasive that this cause of moving matter is something other than a power pervading the matter, just as soul pervades us. Then this power is either self-moving or it's moved by some other power. But if it is moved by another power, this other power will not be able to be moved unless it's moved by another power, which is absurd. Therefore, there is some per se self-moving power, which must be divine and eternal. So the active principle is said to be a self-moving cause of matter. So it's able to cause itself to be differentiated in a way because it's self-moving. Now, how exactly does it differentiate itself? I'm not exactly sure. However, One way that it might differentiate itself is the same way that pneuma might differentiate itself, because many sources seem to identify the active principle either with fire or with pneuma. I've given you one source for this on the handout from Aetius. The Stoics declare that God is intelligent, a designing fire which proceeds methodically to the generation of the cosmos, encompassing all the seminal logoi according to which each thing comes to be in accordance with fate. They also declare that God is pneuma, which pervades the whole cosmos, taking on names because of the alterations of the matter through which it passes. So we might say that the active principle sort of takes on characteristics of pneuma, namely pneuma's ability to differentiate itself. And this is why many sources seem to identify the active principle with pneuma. And likewise, a few sources seem to identify the passive principle with the passive elements, earth and water. And so maybe the passive principle is unqualified in the same way that earth and water are unqualified. So that might be a potential benefit or supporting piece of evidence for the inertness analysis of unqualifiedness. Now, the problem, of course, is that the principles and elements are distinct, according to Diogenes Laertius. And so there needs to be some account of, okay, how can the principles continue to be distinct from the elements if the principles take on the character or become identified in some way with the elements? And so I think there are a few different interpretive options there. Maybe I won't get into them right now. But yeah, I think that's a potential worry for that addition to the inertness analysis of unqualifiedness. So as I said, I'm not particularly wedded to the inertness analysis. I do think it satisfies the condition that only the passive principle is called unqualified and is unqualified, while the active principle is not. I do think it potentially allows us to maintain the distinction between formlessness and unqualifiedness as well, if we could find a way to maintain that the principles and the elements are distinct, and that if we can find a way to maintain the principles, here's why it allows us to maintain the distinction between formlessness and unqualifiedness, because unqualifiedness is not the lack of elemental characteristics according to this analysis. It is the lack of being enduringly differentiated, the lack of having an inherent cause of differentiation. Whereas formlessness would remain the lack of the basic characteristics of the four elements, if we can find a way to maintain that view somehow. So I think that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Any questions? Yes. Yeah, Brooke. Ricardo, Brooke, and
I apologize if I'm not on my game during Q&A right now, but I'll try my best.
no problem.
Thanks so much.
Brooke, Ricardo, and
I feel like I missed something, which if you're accepting that if they're relatives towards each other, they have to be differentiated, then how does it work on the enduringly differentiated model that the passive principle is differentiated and relative? I don't quite see how that solves the problem. I feel like I'm missing something really important and obvious. So, because isn't that the charge that if they're relatives towards one another, they have to be differentiated?
I don't quite understand yet, but let me ask. Are you worried that since they are relatives, they're differentiated, right?
Right.
How to differ on. And if they're differentiated, keep going. Yeah, you finish.
So if they're differentiated, but only the active principle has a cause to differentiate itself, then how is the passive principle going to differentiate itself?
Through the active principle's actions on it. Yeah, so the idea would be the passive principle, of course, is differentiated and becomes differentiated by the active principle's actions on it. Right, but it doesn't have an inherent cause solely in virtue of being the passive principle of its being differentiated.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that might be a bit tricky. I'm just now thinking of this. That might be a bit tricky insofar as they're relatives. And it might, because it's a relative, it might automatically get the cause somehow. But maybe I could say something like, it doesn't have an inherent cause of, like, which is a part of it somehow, which differentiates it.
Yeah, so I guess that is maybe where my worry is. Like, I see like once one of these two things has the capacity to differentiate itself, the other thing is going to be different from it by virtue of that move. But it is then different from the account of differentiated relatives in the Duncombe, where they have to co-constitute each other as having powers to act, to stand against each other. Somehow I feel like there's, and it could be that this is like a special case where you don't need to have the power of being passive, for example, to differentiate yourself. You could just fall, if you're the passive principle, into being different because something over here made itself different, which is what I take you to be saying. But it just feels like it's a slightly different than account of what differentiated relatives are. They're not reciprocally constituted to each other.
Yeah, and so I guess point taken. I think I might need to think a little bit more about this. I do agree that insofar as they are relatives, I don't like to talk of like constituted by, but maybe like they're characterized by their relation to one another somehow.
Right.
Yeah, and insofar as like the passive principle is characterized by its relation to the active principle, there is the worry there that it might have an inherent cause of it might be inherently related to a cause of its being enduringly differentiated. The thing that I want to say is that it doesn't have a part, I guess, that it doesn't have a part of the passive principle which enduringly differentiates it. Because the active principle still isn't a part of the passive principle, even if they're characterized by their relation to one another.
And then I guess the problem, if I could just, is that if we have to have a body constituted by a power of some kind, right? And so we don't want the passive principle, maybe we don't want both active and passive maybe to have the capacity to act and be acted on, but they still need as bodies, a power. Having a power feels like some kind of differentiation in a substance, right? That makes it a body.
Maybe even enduringly so. Yeah.
I have one more small point, and it's more of a point than a question. I mean, my worry about the water and earth satisfying the condition, this idea of being unqualified, is like just that. I mean, I've looked at those sources and I find them puzzling, right? Because like there would never be a scenario where they're not permeated by pneuma.
Sure. Yeah, that's true.
So then it's like, how could you define water and earth in that way when they'll never, ever exist in that way? They'll always be secondary to the cosmogonic burst of fire and be permeated by pneuma. So it feels like, I don't know, those sources that describe them in those ways, it feels like they're doing some other kind of work once pneuma has been determined to be the combination of air and fire. So it feels implicated in those debates around, well, how can you have a basic body that's actually constituted, I don't know, but like, made and composed out of two other bodies. Like it feels part of those criticisms of pneuma as the active principle, but it doesn't really make sense as a Stoic position to me.
And it doesn't make sense as a Stoic position because it's never found in actuality. Is that the idea?
Yeah. Like the Stoics kind of need air and fire to exist as elements. And then they also need there to be something primary, which is pneuma, which is a combination of air and fire, but nevertheless has to have priority over the elements if we're to understand fire. Demiurgic fire or demiurgic pneuma creates the elements next. Sorry. Why?
I don't follow the priority claim. Sorry.
I might have missed the last bit too, but
well, the elements we're told come out of in the cosmogony are created second to whatever substance is.
I think it's actually very complicated what's happening there. I don't know if I agree with that necessarily. I think some elements are still around before they're said to be produced.
Like in the sense, the Timaeus of these like traces that haven't yet been formed?
I mean, I think this is a controversial question that many people have different views on.
Okay. Okay.
I have my own particular idiosyncratic views on it. That the same fire that's present in the current cosmic order is present during the conflagration. The same air that's present during the current cosmic order is present in the initial stage after the conflagration. I think it's the same four elements all the way through, essentially. Yeah, I mean, that's my view. We can get into that later if you want, but I take it that wasn't really the main point. The main point was, or a different point was, if the passive elements, earth and water, are never found in their pure state, then what's the point of?
Feels like to help you with the problem you were dealing with at the end is like, then how do I distinguish between these? Like, what if you just take that out of the picture, then you don't have that problem.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't feel a big worry about them never being found in that pure state. The Stoics seem to be fine with sort of weird thought experiments that never happen in actuality. There's a really weird bit in Plutarch, quoting Chrysippus, where he describes the cosmos breaking apart because there's this like incorporeal middle outside of the cosmos that causes it to break apart. And so they do seem to derive things about like possible states of affairs and necessary states of affairs on the basis of hypothetical thought experiments, which never actually happen.
Sorry, and then I'll stop. But like, that's great. Like they look like contemporary philosophers, amazing. But like, it might explain if like those are never real states, why they never use the language of apoyos to talk about the elements. Like, because there aren't consequences of the thought experiment for what really exists. So why would you create definitions that apply predicates that were made on Mars to the world we live in here?
Sure. Let me write that down and think about it more. I think that's a good point. Yeah.
Ricardo.
Thank you. Well, first, I would like to understand better in the simplistic passage. It's this.
Which one?
Yes, well, I need a long one.
Sure.
What are the three or four kinds of uses of the term qualified is presented. So the third one is the one that you translate here as the third and most specific sense of qualified, which they introduced, is one in which they no longer included these non-enduring states, and in which an individual sticking his fist out an individual with his guard up didn't count as qualified individuals. So, what kind of things go into that set? Something that troubles me is that apparently the person with his guard up is given as an example of a non-enduring state.
Yeah.
And later on, the examples given of an enduring state are being prudent and wise, I think. No, like grammatical knowledge. Prudent.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. So, but would an enduring state include being red? Or being red? Or being hot? So if these would be examples of an enduring state, and having one's guard up as an example of a non-enduring state, my trouble is that I don't see why these are examples of these things. Because, for example, I can stay like this 3 hours or more, And these people who often you see on the street who stay like this 12 hours without moving. So having one's guard up can be an enduring state. And on the other hand, being hot can be a non-enduring state. For example, when the temperature of a body drops suddenly, gradually but suddenly, then each one of the different temperatures that it goes through is a very short, it's a non-enduring state.
Sure.
So, so that's one trouble that I have. I mean, why the third category is presented as one that lives in enduring states but lives out non-enduring states? If at the same time the kinds of things you want to live in are alongside being grammarian and being prudent, things like being thought and being read.
Yeah.
And things that you leave out are things as having one's guard or when that can be an endurance. So that's one question. So that's one question that I have. Should I do the other?
Let's talk about that one first. If the second one is related to it. Okay, so the worry is the trained boxer can leave themselves with their guard up for a good amount of time, right? Whereas something could be red for a short amount of time. Something could be hot only for a short amount of time, right? Less time than the person with their guard up.
That's sure.
So why call the really I don't know about redness, but at least heat. Yeah, why call being hot an enduring state while having one's guard up not an enduring state? Good question. Potentially, I imagine they might say a few things. They might say that being hot really is a trait associated with the fire, right? And in a secondary way, I might say that heat is present in a body partially made out of fire, right? And it can become colder as the amount of fire or a certain amount of fire leaves that object, right? But the heat in that case wouldn't be a state of the object. It would be a state of the fire within the object, which endures as hot all the time insofar as it's fire. They might say that. Yeah.
That the heat of fire is enduring. So
yeah.
That's the answer.
Yeah, I think that's one potential thing they might say. Yeah. I guess, yeah, so why does the person with their guard up not count as enduring though? I mean, I think I just have to limit myself to what we get here. And apparently this type of person is different than the prudent person. And the only thing that seems to separate them that I can think of is the presence of some sort of pneumatic cause necessitating its effect. And the person with their guard up, there's no sort of pneumatic cause necessitating them having their guard up, right? Wouldn't this be a somehow disposed relation, having one's guard up? Yeah, so that might be the only reason to put the person with their guard up in the second type rather than the third type. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's one way. I mean that's one hypothesis of how it could work.
Yeah.
But then the only thing, I mean, the only hot thing that would fit in this set would be fire.
Yeah.
All other qualified things wouldn't fall in that category, because you can argue for anything other than fire itself that its heat is something. No, it's something non-enduring.
Yeah, I think that might be the view.
Yeah. Another way of looking at the passage, which Vanessa will love this, is to say that the things that are left out in the third category are things where you don't have a quality present in the body. So given that, and quality being a body, no? So given that the man with his guard, the person with their guard up is in that state, not because of the presence of something present in the person, but just because the person is somehow disposed. Then that's why these kind of things don't fall in the third category, and only those things which are what they are, thanks to the credit of some pneuma, try to represent in them of historic. Only those things would be left. But yes, I agree that this doesn't explain why the contrast is presented as a contrast between enduring and non-enduring. Yeah.
Everything you just said sounded somewhat plausible to me. So I didn't necessarily disagree with any of that, but yeah.
Should I leave the second question for afterward?
Yeah, maybe we can hear Vanessa, and then we come back to your question.
Okay, I also have two, so I'll ask one.
Okay.
So yeah, this is cool. And I would like to try and support your original intuition in favor of no differentiation.
Oh, cool. Yeah, good.
I would like to do that by resisting the idea that principles are relatives in whatever exactly the sense is supposed to be. So two things. First of all, what is a relative is the contradictory of what is per se. And are not the archae per se entities if nothing else is? So that's one thing. And then the other thing is, yeah, okay, of course the active is active relative to the passive, and yeah, fine. But do we need to put it in this category? Isn't this argument perhaps too strong? Because wood is combustible. Is that now a relative because it's relative to fire? Like it seems like everything now is going to be put into the category of relative. So as I recall, this argument that the principles are relatives goes by somewhat quickly. And so I was just coming up on the fly with a couple of reasons to resist it and just stay with no differentiation.
Not opposed to, but I'm not opposed to any of these views except maybe the all properties.
Yeah, right. And also the no properties view, as I understood you.
Well, I'm not
like you to me.
I'm not perfectly happy with that one, but I think it's like a live option at least. But can you explain? So it sounds somewhat like intuitive that the principles could be per se, but like why are they per se?
Well, there is textual evidence where they're described as per se. Now, there's some dispute about how to understand that, like if in the beginning when God is by itself, but I guess just also insofar as they are the fundamental beings of the cosmos, it seems like if anything's going to count as a per se being, those things had better count. So that was the intuition. Roberto has a finger.
Can I jump in on this?
Sure. Okay.
Just
Please.
I mean, on this per se relative dichotomy, and if framed that way, if I understand intuition, it looks like per se means metaphysical is fundamental and proste means dependent.
I don't think it has to mean, I think that what is fundamental will be per se, but I don't think everything per se needs to be fundamental, maybe. I don't think they have to be equivalent.
Then there may be a sense in which principles are per se, are not necessarily per se, right? Because if I follow your argument,
Yeah.
if anything in the world is per se, then there must be, the principles are, but why? Because they're fundamental.
Well, okay, that's true. I did say it was because they were fundamental, but I guess I take that to be less about, maybe I should re-say, maybe it's less about being fundamental and more about being sort of just what they are. Since there's nothing else to make them be as they are. So it's not about their metaphysical fundamentality, but about the fact that they are the sort of original brute posits. And so there can't be anything else making them as they are.
I have my finger on that.
Is that
that okay?
Okay.
Like, that doesn't, I don't think that sounds plausible, but it does sound plausible that the active principle could be per se. If you think that when God is completely substance, then God is totally independent, right? And if you then extended that to the idea that you need to have some unifying cause in order to be qualified or something like that, like then in that sense, you can see how the passive principle would be constituted as unqualified because it doesn't have, it's always dependent on the active principle for its qualification. Like, I feel like that if you accept a version of that, you might then get to a version of what you want to argue.
So, I mean, I will point out, I still don't feel much weight, or I still feel compelled to endorse the view that the principles are per se. Even if I grant that the active principle, the body that is the active principle doesn't need the passive principle in order to exist, I still might say that the active principle, insofar as it's the active principle, needs the passive principle in order to exist. And so by calling,
Sorry.
in order to be the active,
In order to act, right?
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
Yeah.
And so when I took I should say when I took Duncombe, because I don't want to attribute to him anything, but what I extracted from Duncombe was the idea that the principles, qua principles, are understood as relatives. And in trying to describe the passive principle as unqualified, I was just trying to focus on that meaning of the principles rather than the bodies that are the principles necessarily.
Yeah, I'll confess again, I don't understand this constituted by language in the Duncombe account, but there are reasons to think that both of the principles, insofar as their bodies, each of them as a body, are both independent. So I don't have a worked out counterargument, but I guess I'm just thinking, I think that there are resources to resist the idea. Yeah. And on one hand, there's a positive sort of argument that they're per se, however that turns out to go. And then this other argument that maybe making them relatives is too strong because it turns everything into a relative.
I think you're right about that. At least I think you're right that there needs to be like more work done. And putting forward the two options, seeing what arguments there are for each option. Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay, does anyone else have a question before returning to Ricardo? No? Ricardo?
Yeah, thank you. Another question I wanted to ask is that I think I like very much your idea that the passive principle is unqualified in the sense of inert, no? And inert means that it is something that needs to be acted upon in order to be anything, no? And like water, and then you illustrate this relation or what is this state of inertness of the passive principle through the state of inertness of earth and water. So they are inert in the sense that they cannot hold themselves together, but need fire and air, maybe, or the combination of both, which is filling. So just as fire and water and earth are inert in this sense, so too is the passive principle. Now, fine, but what I don't quite understand is that, well, you mean that the relation of the passive principle to the active principle is analogous to the relation between the passive elements and the active elements? But you're saying that, but you're saying in addition that it is the same relation and that the relata are the same. I mean, are you saying that the passive principle is water and earth? No, you're not saying that. The reason I ask is that if you say that the passive principle is water and earth, and that the active principle is fire and air, then one question that can be raised is, aren't the passive and the active principles more basic than fire and air? I mean, aren't they the results of the action of the active principle on the passive principle? And So, I mean, your proposal is compatible with saying that the passive and the active principle are more basic than the four elements.
Sure. I wasn't committing myself onto any particular view on the relationship between the principles and elements. At least I was trying not to.
Right.
So I was trying to say there are a couple options here.
Yes.
One could say the relationship between the active elements and the passive elements is how the relationship between the active principle and the passive principle is realized in the world, such that I can treat them as the same thing, even though in some sense they're distinct. Now, that's like a big hand wave. In some sense, how can they be distinct if it's the same relationship, right? Another option is what you said. They are analogous to one another, such that you can read or make inferences about the relationship between the principles, sort of using the elements as the guide on the phenomenal level. That's what David Sedley calls it. So it's like the interactions between the unobservable simple principles are observable through the elements somehow as a guide to what's going on at the unobservable level. I think that's another option.
Right. Yes. Yeah. The active principle is observable through the active elements.
Or like you can make inferences about
Yes, you can.
but
You have to. I mean, do you keep them as different things, or more directly, do you think that air and fire are made of, so to speak, or I don't know what's the right word here, but made of or composed of or produced by the action of the active principle on the passive principle? Are they the product of the action of one principle on the other?
So I don't believe that actually,
I don't believe that.
but I want to leave that open as a possibility here. I really don't want to get into like too many details about the exact relationships between the principles and elements here, but me in particular, no, I don't think that that's true necessarily. Yeah.
Not because the active principle is identical to.
So I want to maintain the distinction between the principles and elements somehow. Yes. But I don't want to say that fire, for example, is the result of the active principle's activities on the passive principle. Yeah. Even though I think that's an option. I think it's an option.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fine. Please.
Okay, Marisa.
Okay, so one quick comment, just the inertness seems to me to describe the passivity of the passive principle rather than its being apoyos. That seems like a more fitting target. But my question is this, it seems like it's a desideratum for your account to maintain that being apoyos and being amorphos are different.
Yeah.
And my question is why?
Number one, they're different words. Number two, they're presented, they're doing different work, at least in the Diogenes Laertius passage. The passive principle is called unqualified, and both principles are called amorphous, which is consistent with the active principle also being unqualified, but at least it's not called that, right? By Diogenes Laertius or anybody else that I'm aware of, I think. So basically, just because they seem to be presented as if they are doing different work, and
Okay.
yeah.
What about this? You've got the Tobias passage, so this requires taking on some other things, but Posidonia said that the substance of the whole of things, i.e. matter, which I would then understand as being what things are made of rather than Chile in particular, is unqualified and formless.
Yeah.
Does that not get you?
Well, I mean, you might read that as saying like unqualified, i.e. formless, or.
Well, yes, that was my starting point, of course. Why not just do that?
Yeah.
Just take them as sort of like, take apoyos as sort of a not fully technical term.
Sure.
Yeah.
Possibility. Yeah. I mean, at least he also seems to gloss those words in that passage too, right?
Yeah.
So it seems like formless attaches to no particular defined shape, right?
Yes.
And unqualified seems to attach to no person quality.
And that's no differentiation,
Sorry.
I think.
Okay. But going back to the original point, like at least because they receive different glosses, I at least want to find a way to understand and qualify this such that it's not the same thing as formlessness, at least. If there is a potential way of doing that.
Yeah.
And if it's no differentiation, just curiosity, does that just end up amounting to the formlessness bit, do you think? Okay, interesting. Yeah, okay. Cool. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Benjamin.
Thank you very much. I want to go back to the all properties view, just because it's sort of pleasingly absurd. And also it sort of encourages a kind of monism, which I like, that we have all these sort of latent qualities. I was just a little confused on the second bit against. You seem to say that you sort of pick out any bit of this, then that bit is going to be qualified in some way. That seemed to be what you were suggesting.
Or it's not unqualified.
It's
Yeah.
not unqualified.
Yeah. According to the all properties analysis, yeah.
But what if we just go the sort of iamblichus route with sweetness and fragrance? Doesn't that buy you a way out?
Tell me more.
You know, that it's not going to point at some bit of something, see, that's the sweetness of the thing, or the fragrance of the thing, or anything else. It's just that any bit we take out, it's going to have the relative properties, in this case, all the properties.
Yeah, so let me make sure I understand.
You know,
Um,
it seems like you're committed to a sort of Parker view of what qualities are.
so we're not part
A Parker view of what qualities are. And if we just don't accept that, does that then completely tell against the all properties view?
So let me make sure I understand the initial point, though.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm losing my steam. So I said this is a little bit ad hoc because it's not the passive principle that's unqualified according to this count. It's the entirety.
Yeah.
And then you said in response to that, but if you were to isolate a portion of the passive principle, won't it actually still possess all the properties? Was that the idea?
That's what I'm suggesting.
Yeah.
I seem to suggest otherwise they pick out a bit, it's Earth.
Yeah, so I was suggesting at least there's a thought experiment so as to do such that we isolate a particular portion of the passive principle such that it's only underlying some earth, right? And in that case, that hypothetical portion of the passive principle would not possess all the properties. Now, going into the real world, let's go into the real world though. Maybe there are areas of the cosmic order that don't have all the elements mixed in within them. For example, the outer peripheral ring of fire will only be fire. The air atmosphere seems to be air and fire. Maybe the earth doesn't have any water mixed in it at certain points.
I'm sort of trying to push an Anaxaria line here. Yeah, there might be an everything and everything idea, and what's being suggested here. I mean, I think you're right. This is not a story. No differentiation line is good. I'm just trying to figure out who these people are. But that would adopt such a view, and maybe they're kind of neo.
No, so
Anaxarias. Yeah.
So maybe they would reject my claim
Yeah.
that it's even in principle possible to isolate a portion of the passive principle such that it only possesses some of the character. Okay, yeah, good. Yeah, let me know that.
Yeah.
I just had one follow-up on.
Yeah.
You could say that on your argument, which I think is good, the passive principle doesn't have anything to unify it such that you would have participation of all the parts. But then you can have a blend without it necessarily being unified. So the question would be, could you have a blend without, in the passive principle, without any active principle, such that all the parts of the blend are present in all the parts, which is what the Anaxagorean reading would seem to suggest. Because I also had that thought, but then I thought, how could you get there unless it's mixture or a unified body? And both those conditions seem to only be satisfied if you have some either pneuma already having permeated the passive principle, such that mixtures can happen, or some kind of unifying body in there. So that would seem to suggest you could pick out, if the passive principle had all the elements in it, but no way to unify it as either a unified body or make a mixture out of it as a weaker form of, then you totally could pick out bits that were missing other bits. But your objection, I think, would still stand.
Let me make sure I understand. So I've just got the passive principle, and it's got all the bits in it. Right? It's the okay. So I've got all the bits in it. But solely in terms of being the passive principle, it doesn't have a sort of cause unifying the bits or.
To get to where you need to be for the anaxagory and everything for the
Yeah.
Stoics, you need either a blend, which seems to need pneuma, or you need to be a unified body, which also takes a particular hexus of pneuma, and you're not going to have either of those things.
Okay, I think I understand. Yeah, I don't have thoughts right now. I understand. So yeah, good. Thank you.
Any more questions?
I could say a little, I appreciate your desire to be charitable to David Sedley with respect to the no properties view, but he does go down the receptacle path.
Sometimes, but sometimes he also says that the active principle furnishes the passive principle with properties and stuff. And he does treat the principles as bodies. So, I mean, I just think he says inconsistent things sometimes. Yeah. And I was just trying to put the best foot forward for him. Yeah.
Okay. No question. Then let's think the important stuff.
Maybe especially for everyone else.
Yes, thank you.
Not in David's Lisa.
Yeah. And let's thank Ricardo for organizing this.